as we have learned over the years, no part of the shipping industry is walled off from another part. So this is the issue of the fact that our supply chains are in fact global. You have to navigate through the constraints that sanctions engender. One does not want to have your company be penalized, which could be rather severe if you extend yourself way beyond what you should be doing. On the other hand, I think a point that really has not been said enough about among companies is the reputational risk that companies are worried about continuing to do commerce with Russia. And so we're well aware of companies, particularly US companies, just voluntarily stepping out of Russia because they're worried about the reputational risk. And clearly what those companies have done is made a measurement in the trade-off between mitigating reputational risk and mitigating the risk of re-entry, because once you leave a market, particularly one like Russia and other emerging markets where people have very long memories, going back in may not be as easy as coming out. And of course, we have the threat by the Russian Duma to put in place a law that will, in essence, threaten nationalization of what has been left behind.
Business.
Well, it refers, I think, to a number of different things, but particularly in the supply chain in terms of where the sanctions might bite in your supply chain or how you sell things. That's obviously important because what your suppliers may also be subject to sanctions. And if there's a particular critical input or output in which you engage with these other partners, these secondary sanctions could have tremendously important effects. But I think it's important to recognize as a result of all this is that sanctions are not very simple. It's a very complex, both science and art, and people like me get very heavily involved in advising countries and companies about how to navigate through those sanctions and not step in the minefield, if you will. I don't have any clients who want to stay in Russia at this juncture because I think they are worried both about the sanctions and the reputational risk. I think there have been discussions, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, about the trade-off between leaving and coming back in. But I think in the short term, the reputational risk back home is paramount. And don't forget, Russia is not, with all due respect, not a terribly large economy. Certainly compared to the U.S. or China. And so that factor has also been included into their calculations about what to do with respect to Russia's sanctions. Well, I think it's a very good question, Peter. I think some of the scarring that is taking place will be quite permanent, frankly, in the medium run. I think unless there is a change in the power apparatus in Moscow, I'm not sure that we are going to be returning to sort of ex ante normality in the region anytime soon, and that's very sad. I think I've spent 7 years of my life working in Russia and all the CIS states. It's a lovely place. The people are great, but this is going to set back the region quite a bit. I think from an investment perspective and from a trade perspective, and I think what companies are looking at is not just Russia. I think that in and of itself is an issue, but the neighboring countries and what does NATO mean prospectively with respect to making investments in the Balkans, in the countries near Ukraine. I think clearly we have seen unraveling in some of the political and socio-economic fabric, and I think companies are beginning to wonder just how permanent this scarring might be. It really, I think, depends on how the U.S. and China manage this relationship, but both are facing large stakes to make this work. I think Xi has showed himself to be, a pretty insightful leader. He's got a lot of power, obviously, at home, but I think the last thing he wants to do is, scar his own reputation by engaging in a more significant trade or sanction war with the United States. That's my view.
He's
Well, I think it's not going to be good for both sides, clearly, because China is intertwined with our economy, and we obviously are intertwined with China, with the Chinese economy. So I think it's in both sides' interest to operate very carefully, and I think that Biden is quite aware of that, as is she. I think the other point to make, just going back to the last comment, Peter, we were talking about, is I think people maybe not understand the complexity in the China-Russia relationship. It's all not, fun and games between Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi. And, to the Chinese, I think Russia, is an irritant, frankly, as much as an ally. And I would not put it past the Chinese to think about Russia, as a strategic place that they might enjoy doing a little bit more business in, and maybe infiltrating the Russian economy. It's a relatively small economy. So I think the relationship between Xi and Putin is not really well understood. It's not like they're best friends. There's certainly tensions. There are certainly threats that I think China can pose, particularly in the Far East and Russia. And I think Mr. Putin is very well aware of that. And I think there's also been some atmospherics about Mr. Putin overplaying his hand with respect to the Chinese, and that has already spilled over into the press. So I think this is a three-way game, in quotes, if you will, between the U.S., Russia, and China. But if they're thinking rationally, and hopefully they are, there's a lot at stake here, and a lot to lose if mistakes are made. The name of the game here is agility and resiliency in supply chain management and logistics, and that obviously can't be separated from what's happening to consumer demand on the one hand, and what's happening on the supply and at the production side as well. And I think I think we need to unbundle between what's going on in terms of the Russia sanctions and war versus long-term changes in the way supply chains are operating. First and foremost, the introduction of artificial intelligence and machines and automation in unloading and loading ships. That's obviously a long-term trend that has been underway for some time. COVID has exacerbated that, but also changed it a little bit. And so I think unbundling what all these various strands are is very important. And I think the other point, and I think you and I have talked about this in early discussions on the BBC, is that supply chains are multi-tiered, as many people know. It's not just a question of buying a product in China, putting it on a ship and bringing it over to the United States, although that obviously happens. Oftentimes the products that are being imported into the US or other markets, one component is manufactured in China, then value add is spliced onto that, let's say in Thailand, it's then shipped to Brazil where it's finally, wrapped up, and then it's sent. So these supply chains are not sort of bilateral, they're quite complex. And that has the advantage in some sense of adding in redundancy, but also resiliency in the way that you set up and the way that you manage your supply chains and how you price things, how you price the rates and how you fold them into the end user price of what consumers are paying. We live in an economy, certainly in the advanced countries, of having just-in-time deliveries. Well, we ought to be able and willing to pay a higher price for just-in-time as opposed to more of a delay in deliveries. And so I think one of the things that this crisis has been good for, in some sense, and the COVID, both and the war, is consumers understanding that there are trade-offs here. And I think using differential pricing would be extraordinarily helpful in adding resiliency and flexibility to the way that supply chains operate. And I think the more that we can do that, we then can think about potential for reshoring or potential for other physical movements of where these activities take place, which are enormously expensive. And who's to say that you reshore to country X now, that in 5 years from now, country X looks like it's not really a good place to have your warehouse or your production. So you need to be always on your toes and figuring out how much resiliency, how much redundancy, how much agility do I need? But those, to me, are the key words to have front and center, both as a supplier and a shipper. Not only does relocation have its costs and its benefits, but where you relocate today, you may well find in 5-10 years' time that may not have been, the right place to go. On the other hand, where we're seeing rigidity in these markets is there's not been enough investment in incumbent plant and equipment. And take the case of India, for instance, very large economy, sitting smack in the middle of the Indo-Pacific. And when you look at the ports on the eastern side of India, those ports are not very well dredged, largely because of political economy reasons and union power. Maybe some people don't know is 30% of ocean shipping coming into to India is transshipped. And one of the major venues for that is Sri Lanka. So if you're shipping something from the eastern part and you're coming into India, you have to probably, depending on the size of the ship, unload in Sri Lanka, put it on another ship to be able to get into the ports on the eastern side of India, because those ports are not just deep enough. That obviously impacts the price, delivered price to India. It affects the exports out of India. And what's interesting is, we're entering an era where Mr. Modi will be the chair of the G20, this December. So he will have a very important platform on which to speak about the future of global trade, not just for India, but emerging markets more generally. And I think this issue about how competitive is India, how competitive should India be, particularly in its ocean shipping and logistics, is, I think, an underrated issue for the Indians to think about. It's complex, as we all know, because of all the interest groups involved, but it's a very thorny problem, and no one has been willing in India, frankly, to bite that bullet. Yeah, I think, clearly the inflation issue is very clear here in the U.S. I think the way the Fed, has to play this is, setting expectations ahead of time, which is what they did, and then, begin to ramp up interest rates. Of course, exacerbating that is what has happened in the oil market, as oil prices have risen, because we have boycotted, in essence, the purchase, and other countries have boycotted the purchase of Russian oil. That obviously everyone is mindful of, and are we willing to pay that higher price of oil in order to sanction Russia? I think with respect to infrastructure in the United States, I've been calling for infrastructure reform for a long time, and I think the bill that Mr. Biden has, goes some way. The problem is that he's hemmed in by his opponents on Capitol Hill. Infrastructure is a very boring topic for many people until they get in their cars or until they get on an airplane, and then they say, why am I waiting on the tarmac? Why can't I get through this congestion on this bridge in my car? But then that fades from memory. And from my perspective, the real economic advantage that the United States has is we have a very large economic space, and the interstate highway over the last century really has been the secret sauce to our success by allowing us to exploit economies of scale, economies of scope. Yet, because we have not invested and reinvested in that infrastructure, we're losing our competitive edge. But again, because it's not a terribly appealing or sexy topic, people sort of eyes glaze over. But when you really think about how important it is, we must make greater progress on this. But I think right now, given the politics on Capitol Hill, which are about as low as I can remember them, certainly when I was working there, it's not clear how much progress we're going to be able to make on this matter. But it is to me, it's sort of numero uno issue for the long-run economic health of the United States. So I wish it was more in the bill, and I hope the bill actually passes. But even if it does, it's hardly enough.
For this to play out?
Well, I think it's in everyone's interest, frankly, and I don't mean this in a snide or a simplistic way, but it is in everyone's interest, I think, to get on with it. Listen, the labor unions have enormous market power right now. The shippers obviously are also under attack because of some of the rates that their customers are worried about. But I think if they are able to have a meeting of the minds between both the wage rates and the introduction or further introduction of automation, which is clearly uppermost in the union's mind, I think we've got to be able to come to some kind of resolution. Luckily, this is not a brand new contract. It's an extension of the existing contract, and the current extension expires on July 1. I think if the union is smart, they'll probably want something a little bit more than they have in the past about protection regarding automation. But listen, automation is coming. It's coming, and it's coming everywhere in the world. And I think the longer that both the port side and the worker side understand that, and I think they do, they have to sit down and figure out, okay, how do we carve up this pie so that we can get on with economic growth, which is not just obviously in the West Coast, because it's a throat choke point for the rest of the U.S. economy. So I hope it works out. I suspect it will. I don't see the notion of federal mediation coming in, but economists like me, I've been wrong before.